Okay, so let's back up a little bit for the translator. So I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Kansas. And I have also worked for a major journal, actually the Russian Review. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And I also have close working ties with other editors of a couple other journals. And so I'm bringing in a lot of personal, real lived experience in helping you get your writing published in Western academic journals. My presentation is split up into two large sections. The first is the process of getting published and the timeline that it takes, because it can take a very long time. And the second half will be about things you can do to maximize your chances of getting published. So the first thing that you have to do is, and I'm assuming you already have something written for this section here, is finding journals to publish in. You've already heard a little about discerning between good journals and poor journals. And so once you figured out what the good journals are, and you're aiming to apply to them, what do you do at that point? How do you approach these journals? And there are a few ways to do this. The easiest and most direct way is to respond to a CFP, or a call for papers. These are where journals or conferences will solicit papers for publication on specific themes. Now, the tricky part is that you have to find these CFPs in the first place. And there are a couple fantastic resources to find these things. The first are listservs, which are email groups that you can add your email address onto, and they're a discussion network of people with shared interests. Two of the biggest ones for American academics are HNet, that's the first URL down there, and the second one is LSoft. And at this second link here, at the Catalyst website, you can look at a list. You can look at a list of 52,000 different listservs. Some of them are going to be relevant to you, most are not, but it's worth it to poke through them and see which ones are going to be a good fit for you. Now, because I'm coming from a background in the humanities and social sciences, I can't really say much about the hard sciences, mathematics and physics, as in like where to find these resources, but there are listservs for those. Unfortunately, I just can't tell you where they are, because I don't know. The other way to approach journals is through professional organizations. They also send out calls for papers, they organize conferences, and there are also great ways to connect people within your discipline through this medium of the internet, linking people from all over the world. So for example, in geography, in America, the largest geographical professional organization is the American Association of Geographers, AAG, which holds an annual conference that has 10,000 people. And with 10,000 geographers, all in the same very large conference center, there are so many opportunities to talk with people, to meet editors. Usually different publishers have their own booths set up, so you can go and directly approach them at conferences as well. And it's also a great way to find co-authors and other opportunities for publishing. But there's also another route of finding journals, and that is just directly contacting the journal itself. And that's what this journal is here. Every journal has its own website. Usually some of these are through their publisher, so Elsevier or Sage or Routledge, Taylor and Francis. But on their website, they will give you a complete author's guideline on how to submit to this journal. And most journals have an open submission policy, meaning that you can submit something for a journal at any time. And this is great because you don't have to wait for a special issue to roll around. You can, when you have something ready to publish, you can just directly send it to them. The two most common methods that you can find on their website, and they'll tell you exactly what to do for that particular journal, is to email the editor directly with your paper, or to use an online submission system. And the online submission system is a newer process that's gaining a lot more use. And those are really convenient because it really helps speed along the review process that I'll talk about in a few minutes. But these author guidelines that are on the website are extremely important. And I'll go into detail on some of those a little bit later. But just keep in mind that even at this initial submission stage, it's possible to be rejected. Meaning you send your paper into the editor, and before anything else even happens, the editor will give it a quick skim to see if it's a good fit, if it's well written, if it has no glaring problems. Because if it's poorly written, is not the kind of article they're looking for that journal, or has major issues like there's blatant plagiarism, or it's really short, or isn't up to their academic standards, they can just reject it outright. And they will usually tell you why they're rejecting it, so you can have an idea of what to do to improve your submission for the next time around. Unfortunately, the journal submission process and the whole publishing process, if you get something through the first time with no problems, that's like a magical scenario. It hardly ever happens. You're usually involving lots of rounds of revisions and rewrites, and it does entail a lot of rejection, and that is something that you have to be prepared for. Just because you have something that you think is good doesn't necessarily mean that when you give it to someone, they're as excited about it as you are. The review process is something that can take months or even years. So what happens is when you submit an article for publication, the editor will take a look at it, and they'll make an initial yes/no decision on whether it's something that they should send out for review. What this process involves the editors looking through a database of people that they know, other academics, who share similar areas of expertise as the themes of your article. So for example, if you are writing a paper on dissident Soviet Jewish writers, then when you submit that to a journal for potential publication, they are going to look for potential reviewers that have expertise in that field. They're not going to give it to someone who does physics, right? They're going to look for someone who has a background in that and has published in that field and on that very narrow theme. But this search process can take months, and I know because I was the one doing the searching for a lot of this time. Contacting reviewers, waiting for them to respond. Sometimes they say no, you have to go further down your list. I mean, sometimes it can take a few months to even find 2 reviewers who agree to review a paper. And this process has nothing to do with you. It's going to take a long time, but you can't worry about the time that it's taking. It's just one of these things that it's a very long process. Once the reviewers have said yes, usually they have 3 to 6 months to review your paper. And that's a very long time, and usually they're late. Again, I know this because I had to bother these people that were supposed to be doing reviews who were missing deadlines and getting them to turn them in. Because they're not just reading it and saying whether they like it or not. They're giving comments, they're making recommendations, they are really critiquing the paper in order to make it the best version of that paper it can be. It's not a passive process, it's very active, it's very engaged. And the important thing here is to not bother the editor during this time period. You're probably not going to hear anything for a long time, but don't keep sending emails, don't keep calling, because you'll get a bad note in their spreadsheet. Just let the process take its time. If it's been about 6 months and you haven't heard anything, it's appropriate to send one email. It's like, hey, I wrote this paper, I just wanted to know what an update is, it's been 6 months, just curious as to how it's going. That's fine, like 1 every 6 months No problem. Every week? No way. The review process itself, the most common kind for academic journals is a double-blind peer review. This type of review means that you, as the author, do not know who is reviewing your paper, and the reviewers do not know who the author is. So your name is taken off of everything, and when you receive comments back, they also have no names on it. So it's a completely anonymous system. The only people that know who is reviewing which papers are the editors, and they don't tell anybody, because this helps foster an atmosphere of academic integrity, because if you know somebody who wrote this paper and you're reviewing it, there could be pressure to not really do a good job reviewing it, or to approve something that's maybe not so great. So this double-blind peer review is really looking to produce the best kind of writing so that the editors are happy with what they're publishing, so that their journal looks good, so that you as an author are producing the best paper you can. And what these peer reviews are looking for, they're looking for quality of writing, that your arguments are sound, that you're coming to good conclusions using logic, and they're academically rigorous, that you are forging new territory, that you're not just rehashing an old argument, that you are really bringing something to the table, and you are doing it well. And this also is the valuable contributions to the field. How are you interacting with what other people are saying on this particular subject or in this particular field, and what do you have to add? This is a big part of this review process as well, for reasons that we'll get into in just a little bit. And also, because this is a peer review, what that means, that peer part, is that the people that are reviewing your papers are other professors, they're other faculty members. Even if you're a grad student and you're publishing, or trying to get a paper published, it's going to be professors at other universities that are going to be reviewing those articles. So it's a very high-level review process, and therefore the responses you get from the reviewers are usually going to be very good. Sometimes for you, they can sting because they can also be kind of rough. So when the reviewers finish their comments and send them back to the editor, then the editor has to make a decision. The editor is not bound by the decisions that the reviewers make, but the editor takes into consideration heavily what the reviewers have to say about this paper. And then the editor makes a decision, one of three categories that are up here on the screen right now: accepted with minor changes, revise and resubmit, or reject. Accepted with minor changes, again, is this like magical option. It is one that rarely happens and is usually the result, like the people that get accepted with minor changes have been publishing for decades. They know the game. They know how to write these papers. They know the audience that they're writing for. They've been through all this before. If you are just trying to break into the academic publishing scene, if you get an accepted with minor changes, you need to immediately go out, go to a nice restaurant, pat yourself on the back, buy a nice bottle of wine. Like, you got it made. You did an excellent job, and no one can ever take that away from you. But most of the time, what you're going to get is a revise and resubmit, which is not as bad as it sounds. Basically, all it's saying is that your paper has really good ideas that are worth publishing, but your paper has some things in it that need to change. Maybe one section isn't as developed as it should be. Maybe you're ignoring a part of the literature. Maybe your structure needs to be flipped around just a little bit. But the point is that you need to put a little bit more work into it and to beef up a few sections so it can be published. And usually when you get a revise and resubmit, your editor will give you a time frame, usually between 1 and 3 months of revisions and then resubmitting to the editor. And then at that point, it's just the editor's decision to decide whether or not they're going to publish a paper. The tricky part here is, though, how to interpret or understand reviewer comments. So usually you'll have two reviewers, And when you get feedback on your paper after the review process, sometimes the reviewers will agree on things, like your paper needs a little work in these sections, but other times they can be pretty different from each other. And so how do you deal with that? How do you deal with one reviewer who says, your paper's great, here's a couple things, and the other reviewer says, I have major problems with your paper and I don't think it's ready. So how do you synthesize that? It's a hard question to answer. The best advice I can give is that if you get a especially harsh critique, read it, take a day, and then read it again, and then go back to it and see what they're actually trying to say. Because sometimes academics can be unintentionally mean or intentionally mean, and sometimes it stings a little bit more the very first time you read it. So if you go back to it a couple days later and try to actually figure out the critiques that they're making, you can do a better job. Now, you don't have to address literally every point that they ask you to make, but you have to nevertheless take into consideration the points that they're making and synthesize that into your paper as a whole. Now, sometimes they'll give you very specific things to do, and if they're easy to do, you might as well go ahead and do them. Because you make them happy, moves the paper along, increases your chances to get it published. Now, if you get a rejected message on your paper, it will also come back with reviewer comments, except in this case, both reviewers and the editor have decided that there are some pretty big things wrong with your paper. And that sounds a little harsh, and it is, but it's also not the end of the world. It doesn't mean that this idea is dead. It doesn't mean that it's done. What it means is that you just have to put a lot more work into this idea, maybe rewrite the whole paper, and then try again to submit it. Not necessarily to the same journal, but to another journal in that same field. Okay, so were there any questions on this, the first part, about the timeline or the actual publishing process? Okay, if there aren't, we'll have questions at the end as well, but I just wanted to see if there are any there. Okay, so now on to the second part of this presentation, maximizing your chances for getting published. Making sure I'm on time right here. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do is make sure that you're a good fit for the journal that you're approaching. And this is a really broad category, and it's also a subjective one. It's not just, do you meet this list of criteria, yes or no? It's, does your style of writing, does the way that you present your ideas work with the general environment of this journal? When you read this journal, do you want to write like the people in it, or do you think you write like the people that are publishing in it? Are you going to be a good conceptual fit, right? So the way to understand this and know this is you have to read a lot. You can't just intuitively figure it out by thumbing through an issue, right? You have to dig through, read multiple articles from multiple years in the same journal, and also pay a lot of attention to the abstracts and citations that people are using. So for a general rule of thumb, I would say if you're looking to publish into a journal, read 5 to 8 articles from that journal to get a good fit, or to get a good feel for what that journal is all about. And then read about 50 to 80 abstracts. So not the whole papers, but these little paragraph summaries about what these papers are. Is your idea going to fit in this bigger picture? Because if it's not, then your chances of getting published in that particular journal are not so high. Now, maybe your paper is just a better fit for a different journal, and that's also totally fine. It's also helpful to talk with colleagues, especially if they've published in your target journal. So if you know that your friend published in the Russian Review, talk to him and say, like, so what did they say? What sort of things did they want you to do? Sort of get a feel for what that process was, because for every journal, it's going to have a different process to it. Every editor is different. Every editorial team is different, and the kinds of articles that they're looking for is going to vary from journal to journal, even within the same discipline. Other things to look for are commonly cited sources. Who is publishing or who is writing these papers? Are they mostly monographs? Are they single author? Or are they multiple author? And if they're multiple author, what's the norm? For example, in history, it's most common to have single authored articles. In social sciences, it's relatively common to have 2 to 5. In hard sciences, it's completely acceptable to have 15 to 20. So depending on your discipline and on the journal you're looking for, your team, who you're writing your articles with, is also a consideration. If it's a real team effort, if you and 3 colleagues have really put a lot of time into this idea, make sure that the journal that you're targeting is fine with publishing papers from multiple authors. Other things to look for are who is the intended audience of this journal? Is it for other academics? Is it for students or for graduate students? Is it for professionals in like a more technical journal? Also look at things like the readership. How many people are subscribed to this journal? What libraries and universities are buying this journal? Who has access to it? Because that can also influence your decision-making process in choosing the journal that you want to submit to. This also includes things like open access. Is your article going to be behind a paywall, or is it going to be freely available to anyone who wants to find it? This is a big concern, especially if you are at a university that does not have institutional access to these large databases of articles. And it can be a real concern because usually when you publish with a journal, there's a stipulation that you do not publish that piece of writing anywhere else. They have copyright over it. And if you ever want to publish again, you have to acknowledge and maintain that copyright. If you get published by a journal that says never publish this anywhere else, and you sign the paper and say okay, and then you try and publish that paper in other places, that can be the thing that makes sure you never publish again. Because these editors have databases with the names of every reviewer, the names of every author in them, with notes like this person is great to work with, or this person is always late, or this person is a terrible liar. You want to have good notes. You don't want to have the bad ones, and I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Other things to look for is the acknowledgments and the funding sections, because these are important things to notice or to note in your papers. If, for example, you had help from friends, colleagues writing your paper, it's appropriate to put that in the acknowledgments. It's appropriate to put in the acknowledgments your university. And also, you should definitely mention any funding that helped you accomplish your particular research project. And that's just standard practice across the board. But for how to make that look and where to put it in your paper, you need to be looking at these journals and how to gauge the way you need to write that. So these author guidelines that are on the websites of all of these journals are also, and just come back to them, they're really, really important. They will tell you things like how long your article can be. Some journals have a cap at like 5,000 words. They want more think pieces or white papers. They don't really want these really long, flowy, really exaggerated in length kind of explorations on a certain topic. Wait, okay, yes? Okay, sorry about that. I'll try to use my hands less. So yeah, things like length is a really important thing because, especially if you already have your article written, you have to make sure that your journal accepts articles of that length. Now, the standard length of an academic article is around 8,000 to 12,000 words. Anything more than that is probably going to be too long. And unless it's a very specialized journal that wants shorter articles, 8,000 is like the target low number. The last journal that I published in wanted a word count of 10 to 12,000 words, for example. These author guidelines will also tell you things about your formatting, what fonts to put it in, the size, like the size of your spacing, whether they want new lines or how far to indent your tabs. All of the basic mechanical stuff of how to format your paper will be in these guidelines as well. One of the most important things, though, is the citation style. How do they want you to cite things? Do they want inline citations? And if so, what style? And do they want a bibliography? Do they want a reference section? Are footnotes appropriate? Are endnotes appropriate? And if so, what style? All of that will be contained in these author guidelines. And so it's important that you are constantly returning to them to understand and make sure that you are meeting all these steps. Because I can tell you from experience, it's a real pain if you write, if you have all inline citations, but the journal you are applying to only accepts footnotes. To change everything is a real hassle, unless you're using a reference manager or something. It makes it a little easier, but still, it can be a real nightmare. It's better to look before so you can be prepared as you write. And if you have any questions, if any of the author guidelines are unclear, feel free to email the editors and say, hey, I'm working on an article, I have a couple questions, things I'm unsure about, and then list them out. And most editors are more than happy to help because they want submissions, because they want to be publishing, right? They still want a job, so they want you to give them things to publish. Another thing about being a good fit is the appropriate style and tone. And Thaddeus started to touch on this a little bit in writing abstracts. And a lot of this, some of this you can take from the style guide or the author guidelines, but other things are going to be from reading a lot of the issues of the journal. And also practicing good academic writing. And again, this is like a relativist position, so good academic writing in a Western sense, which, if you're unfamiliar with Western academic writing, reading it is the process by which you can familiarize yourself with it. So is the structure of your paper clear? Do you have an outline for it? Do you have clear sections where all of your paragraphs make sense, there's a logical flow to your paper, you have introductions, you have main points, you have a conclusion, like basic essay writing things. Is your actual writing clear? Are the words that you're using making sense? Is it the right word? Are your sentences making sense? And this is something that we're going to talk about in a little bit as well. In other terms of style and tone, bigger, longer, fancier is usually not better. I've had so many professors and also editors that I'm working with where they keep drilling into your brain. Be concise, be concise. If you can say something in 3 words instead of 7, say it in 3 words, because that allows you to have more space to actually get the ideas down without all of this extra fluff. That might sound nice and make it sound poetic. And if you're publishing to maybe a literature journal, it might be more appropriate. But if you're publishing in the sciences, aim for concision. Be short and to the point while still fully explaining everything. And then also, as Thaddeus mentioned, write in the third person as a general rule. Don't use I, don't use we, and never, ever, ever use you. You especially is inappropriate in academic writing, and the long-standing convention is to use the third person, right? Meaning this paper, or this research shows, rather than I did this, or we are going to do that, right? So focus on writing in the third person. Another big thing is making sure that you have the right sources. And I mean, in one sense, yes, you need to have the right sources for your particular topic, but also having the right sources in terms of the broader literature, the conversation, the academic conversation that you are entering into with your paper. So, because your piece that you are submitting does not exist on its own. It has all these ties to other works, right? The academic work that's come before it, the current research of your peers, all of these things, in some, maybe even minuscule ways, contribute to the place of your idea in the constellation of the knowledge of a particular field. And that means that you have to acknowledge that context and make sure that you are positioning your paper where it belongs, okay? And this means that you also need to keep reading the new literature in your field. If all of your major citations are from the 60s or 70s, and you don't have anything after that, what that is showing to an editor is that you are 40 years disconnected from the academic conversation. But you're publishing in 2016, there's a huge time gap there, and you need to show that you understand the scholarship that has come before you in a particular field. And so this moves beyond knowing just the classics of your field, right? The seminal works. You also have to be reading the things that are coming out in multiple journals, right? It helps also to attend conferences where you're real at the forefront of the production of knowledge in your field, where you're hearing new ideas, you're collaborating with people. You have to be involved in this conversation if you want to get published. Because if you ignore this broader literature, on purpose or not, it's going to be very, very hard for you to get published. Another question is, how many citations do you need? And which citations do you need? And that is also a question that you can answer by looking at other articles written in your field and in that particular journal. Who are they citing? How often are they citing? What's the convention here? And I have some real life examples towards the end where I'll touch on this one as well. Plagiarism, and I know we've talked about this already, plagiarism will automatically get you rejected if they catch you. And that might be a big if, but it's an automatic rejection, okay? And even if it comes out, say 20 years later, that you plagiarized in an article, that can also, I mean, that's a huge black mark on your career. It's going to be very hard to get published again if word gets out that you plagiarize, okay? So the easiest way to do that is to not plagiarize and just make sure that you are completely protected against any accusations. And Thaddeus talked some a bit about that. There are also numerous resources online. Like this picture right here on this slide is from a very large infographic that wouldn't fit on the screen that you can find if you Google, "Did I plagiarize?" and click on images. And there are multiple resources, like this flow chart, where you can sort of go through these questions just to double check, just to make sure. Actually, especially if you're not sure if you plagiarized, to really help you figure out the question, to put yourself beyond reproach, okay? And this also includes self-plagiarism. So if you wrote an article 15 years ago, and you're writing on the same idea, you cannot just take a chunk of that article and plop it into your new one. You can quote yourself, but you can't copy and paste, or any of the other types of plagiarism that Thaddeus talked about. Because especially when writing articles, this is for the new production of ideas, the production of new knowledge. And if you're just regurgitating old stuff, that's also, I mean, one, it's academically dishonest, and two, you're not actually showing anything new. If you need to rely on things that you've written before, quote yourself like you would quote anybody else. In the long run, that's going to be better, one, because you're not plagiarizing, and two, your citation count will increase. And if you, especially like if you're applying for tenure in an American like professorship or applying to an American professorship, one of the ways that they gauge how productive and influential of an academic you are is by how many times your works are being cited. And if you're citing yourself, you can give yourself a nice little cushion. So, and the other thing is, again, just to touch on it, if you got to be really vigilant about plagiarism, because if it comes out later, even if it was inadvertent, it can do irreparable damage to your career. And nobody wants that. Nobody wants that. There's also a question of how to incorporate non-Western sources. So this is an issue of translation, but also because if you want to bring in this other literature that doesn't exist in like the milieu of your discipline, you're going to be bringing in a lot of unfamiliar work. And that is totally fine. You just have to put it into the correct context. How do these authors, say you have like a bunch of Russian or Ukrainian academics, how is what they're writing fitting into this global international conversation? What are the connection points, and where do you fit into this map as well? So I'm not saying by any means don't use non-Western sources. By all means, do use them, but just like with your own writing, make sure you put it into the broader context. So a note on translation. You absolutely cannot rely on automatic translation. It's just not going to do anything for you. And the amount of effort that it takes to fix an automatic translation is often greater than just manually translating yourself. But even then, a manual translation, like was brought up earlier, you can still lose the point. You can lose the voice. You can even lose everything that you were trying to say. The best option is from the beginning to write in English or French or German if you're approaching French or German journals. From the beginning, even if your proficiency in that language is not perfect, because it's easier to fix something that starts in English than to rely on translation. And this is where you can rely on colleagues. If you have American or Western British colleagues and say, hey, I have this idea, I want to write this thing, I know my English isn't so good, but I know you kind of do the same thing, why don't we collaborate? Like, so here's my outline, here's what I want to do, and you co-author the paper together. That way you don't have to worry so much about the language part. You can be responsible for the ideas and the brainstorming. So making these connections to the international academic community is also really helpful in this regard. And also, just to point out, translations of your own work is not new scholarship. It might be new to the audience you're presenting it to, but, I mean, like the example I gave before, if you published it 15 years ago, it already exists in the scholarship in a particular moment in time, in a particular context. So bringing that up to the present also requires you to bring that context with it and to then put it into the contemporary context as well. Simply translating an old article that you wrote, while you might be able to sneak it through, is just not a good plan. Because again, if it comes out that this is just a translation of something you wrote before, this can be a stain on your career. So I would advise to just not do that at all. Cite yourself if you have to, but always be striving to produce new knowledge. And so this sort of comes to the full circle aspect of publishing, right? Because when you publish or submitting to a journal, reviewers are going to be looking at your paper, as we discussed. At the same time, once you get into these databases, into these systems, once these editors get to know you a little bit, they understand your areas of expertise, you are more than likely going to be asked to referee or to review some papers. And it's important that you say yes. Even though you don't get paid for it, even though it might be a big time commitment, if you can do it, you should say yes. Because for every one paper that's submitted, there are at least 2 reviewers. And that includes papers that don't get published, okay? So that includes even the ones that are rejected. So there's way more reviewers working than people writing articles or for submission, right? So the more that you contribute by reviewing and helping in this process, the more favorable it is that editors will look on you. And it's all part of playing the game, of being a good academic, of participating in this conversation. And also, you might be asked to give book reviews, and you should also give those serious consideration as well, because they do count as a publication. It's a minor publication, but nevertheless, a book review of 500 to 1,000 words is something that is relatively easily done, and it puts you in the good graces of the editors of these journals. Submit often, but never submit the same article to multiple journals at the same time. This goes back to this copyright issue, because if both journals are interested and say, yes, we want to send these out for review, then you're stuck in a position where you're like, yeah, but these other guys said that too. And then you're potentially even in legal trouble, and you don't want that. So only submit the same article to one journal at a time. Now, if you get rejected from a particular journal, you're completely free to shop that journal somewhere else. Completely free. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But make sure that it's only under consideration at one journal at a time. And then maybe the biggest thing you can do to make sure that your article actually does get published is to meet your deadlines. If your editor says, we like your paper, we're going to give you a revise and resubmit, but we want to include it in the next issue, and it's going to press in 2 months, so we need your article in 1 month. You got to get it in there, otherwise you're just creating problems for people, right? And even though it might be inconvenient, hey, if you put it in the work, then you get a publication, right? So it's worth it to meet these deadlines, to work on them early, to make sure that you're contributing to this process, because the easier you can make an editor's life, the better they are going to consider you for other things, and they're going to be more likely to be publishing your things. If you keep missing your deadlines, they're not going to give you any more deadlines to miss, right? You're going to miss out on opportunities to publish in the future. And also, every opportunity you have, get to know the people that you're dealing with. Get to know the editors. If you can, go to these conferences. Usually the editors are there. Of all the major journals, they might even have little booths, but at the very least, they're going to be presenting or attending the conference in some form or another. Oftentimes, large professional organizations that host their own conferences have a few journals associated with them. For example, the AAG that I mentioned before, the American Association of Geographers, has 4 journals that the AAG publishes. So by going to the AAG, you get to meet these people, you can go to the editors' booths, you can better understand what each of these journals is looking for, and you can start building these connections to either start reviewing things or to submit your own stuff for publication as well. Okay, so I know that this is going to be a little hard to read, but I don't actually want you to focus on what the actual words are here. I'm going to provide a few examples from the most recent paper that I had published. And this was a co-authored paper with a professor of mine and 4 other students. So there were 6 of us total, which for geography is kind of a lot, but we found a journal where that was not a problem. And this is an example of the amount of citations that we were using, right? Because one of the comments that we got back was, you need to use more citations. And so we were like, okay, we'll get on that. And I'll use this laser thing, but I don't think it'll show up on the TV. No, it won't. If you look, the parts that are in small caps and in blue colored font, all of those are individual citations. Now, even though it's hard to see, there's actually no direct quotations in this paragraph. Every time we have a quotation, it's to say something like, we are talking about this kind of literature, and then see this author this year and this author this year, because they've covered this section in great depth and we don't have time to go into it. But we're still drawing on that. And other things say like, these people have discussed similar issues, and then a long list of them. Now, it looks I think it looks tacky, and I don't like the way that it looks, but this is what the editors wanted. They wanted it to be very well sourced, and they didn't mind that there were lines of just citations, because this was editor's preference, right? Which, I mean, made us have to read more and make sure we were connecting to this broader context, which is always good. But at the same time, I think it kind of clogs up the writing a little bit, but again, that's what the editor wanted, okay? And this is in part of these author guidelines as well. In terms of references, there was 17 pages of text and 4 almost full pages of references. And this, again, was standard for this particular journal. It's what they expected. And within political geography as well, this is kind of the norm. You have to have a lot of sources. Now, if your paper is on a particular case, maybe like the professional letters of one person, you might have a significantly smaller source list, and that's just fine. It's going to be different for every paper you write, for every journal you submit it to, for every topic you have. But at the same time, you know, be prepared that they can ask a lot out of you as well. And then these, I think these are big enough to see. These are examples of reviewer comments from my most recent publication. Now, I don't know who these 2 reviewers are, but I will say that judging from their comments, we as a group were kind of able to figure out who they might be. But, you know, okay, so I'm going to take a sip of this water if you take a second to look at those there. Yeah. Okay, so reviewer 1 says, "This is a very strong paper that makes an important and pertinent conceptual contribution by introducing the term territorial cleansing. I believe the paper to be publishable in its current form with a few minor changes, but would strongly encourage an additional section to the paper to make it even stronger." So this was basically an accept with minor revisions response, which when we read this one, we were super excited. We thought that this was awesome. We were feeling really, really good about it. And then in the part that I cut off, they went on for quite a while listing some minor things, other citations to include, other books to look at. And then there's this section he talks about, like, add a little section talking about this to make your idea even stronger, and I think it's good to go. Reviewer number 2 was significantly less kind in his response. I'm assuming it's a him, her response. She says, "Unfortunately, the paper as current written falls considerably short of its promise. To begin, there is an inadequate discussion between the proposed framework and that of other, including geographical, approaches. Conceptually, there are many difficulties with this paper. There is a conflation of terms. The point is, there is considerable work that has provided empirically detailed, theoretically informed work on mass violence. This work has not been adequately incorporated into the present manuscript. I regret not being able to provide more positive comments. This is an important topic, and I encourage the authors to take seriously the above comments and consider how their proposed framework informs or is informed by existing scholarship." So the first reviewer says, this paper is great. We felt really good. The second reviewer says, there are so many things wrong with this paper, it's terrible. And we felt really bad. So we had to, the note that we got from the editor was like, here are your reviewer responses. I think that this paper is a revise and resubmit. Look at the things they have to say, synthesize it, and he also had a couple suggestions as well, and then said, get this back to us in 3 months. And we said, okay, no problem. But what was really hard was doing the things that reviewer 2 asked us to do. Because reviewer 1 said, everything here is basically fine, and the editor said, everything here is basically fine, just change some stuff. We were like, how do we even approach what reviewer 2 wants us to do? He wants us to change the entire paper. He wants this paper to be about something else. And so we had to figure out exactly what his critiques were and how much stock we should put into them, how much we should believe him and what he's saying, which is a really hard decision to make. How much do you weigh the advice of this other person? But we did a lot of the things that he suggested. We didn't restructure the paper like he wanted to. We didn't change the focus of the paper like he wanted to. But we addressed many of his concerns. And when we submitted it back to the editor, he said that he was satisfied with the revisions that we had made. And so then we were able to get this article published. So the point of this is to say that figuring out how to deal with these reviewer comments is real touchy. It's real subjective. It's going to be different in every situation. And you should definitely reach out and ask people for advice on how to approach these different things, just so you can make sure that you are writing the best paper that you can. All right, so that's all of it. Do you have any questions in the 5 or so minutes that remain? Yes.
Підкажіть, будь ласка, якщо стаття одразу не була прийнята до друку, і рекомендовано було одним з рецензентів її доопрацювати. Автор доопрацював, за пару місяців знов приніс до тієї ж редакції. Її знов будуть редагувати? Дякую. Рецензувати, вірніше. Дякую.
Yes, yes, yes. So if you get a revise and resubmit, and you do the revisions, and you give it back to the editor, there is a chance that they might want you to do a little bit more work still on it. They can say, like, this is great, everything is wonderful, thank you for the changes, you did a good job, and just publish it. Or they can say, actually, can you take another look at this section? Sometimes, some journals, when you submit it for, like after a revise and resubmit, sometimes they send it back out to the reviewers that initially reviewed it to make sure that they are satisfied with the changes that you made. So, this is highly dependent on the editor and on the journal, and you're really not going to know what their practice is, how they do that, until you're in the process of doing it.
So usually you have a lot of citation in the end of your article. Do you have to mention all of them in your text, in the body of your article?
That is a difference between having a bibliography and having a references list. If you just have a list of references, the only things that go in there are works that you have cited in the actual paper. If you have a bibliography, it's going to be longer and is going to include works that are not directly referenced in the paper itself. And these will generally be like bigger ideas, like surveys of the history of the field or whatever, or these classic works that sort of have to be in there. Things that people reading your article can tell that you have read, even if you're not explicitly discussing it. Does that answer your question? Yeah, and that'll be in the author guidelines and how they want you to format your references, or if they want you to have footnotes, or if they just want a bibliography, or some combination.
Actually, I have a question.
Yeah.
We often hear from people that it's impossible for them to publish because it must be cost a lot. What can you say about that?
Most of the time, publishing in Western academic journals costs $0. If you are getting shaken down to pay to have something published, someone along the line is trying to take a bribe from you. Most of the time, especially when you are contacting editors directly, you're just giving them these papers to review. Now, some journals might ask you to physically mail in a hard copy of your paper, and therefore you might have the cost of postage, and the only exception to this case is if the journal is a particular kind of open access journal that requires the authors to pay to have that article published. Now, the problem, these journals serve a very specific function in the academic community, and it's that once that article is published, it's freely available everywhere. And the reason that they make you pay is because they're not getting paid for working on the journal. They're not paying to maintain a website. They don't charge for subscriptions. So it's like you pay to get it published kind of thing. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with these journals, but I would suggest that you seek out other journals to publish in besides those ones, just because sometimes the cost can be upwards of $3,000 to $5,000, which is prohibitively expensive for every academic that I know. So even in America, it's a ridiculous price.
I have another one. Do you always have to cite the original source? Can you say that when I read in a paper that author A said that, author B said that, can I talk about author's B paper?
Yeah. When I've had to do that, I usually just say, so author A quotes author B in a book, right? If I want to quote author B in that book, what I might say is, author B says this, but in the citation say, in author A, whatever page. But again, this is going, like different journals are gonna have different requirements for that too. But as a general rule of thumb, that's what I would do. But if you're quoting any of author A and it includes a quote of author B, I mean, that gets a little trickier and you just kind of gotta put both of them in there. So. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention and your questions. And I hope that this was useful to you. And thank you for your attention.